Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle. I'm a product specialist here at OCULUS. Welcome to tonight's clinical webcast, How to Get the Most Out of Your Pentacam for Cataract and Refractive Surgery Using the Holladay Report. You have a text box on your GoToWebinar screen where you can enter questions. Feel free to enter your questions during or immediately after the presentation, and we will have some time to discuss them at the end of tonight's webcast. Our speaker tonight needs no introduction. I'm sure most of you know Dr. Holladay. He is a clinical professor of ophthalmology at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and has been teaching optics for over 40 years. It's an honor to have Dr. Holladay with us tonight for this webcast, and on behalf of OCULUS, I would like to express our gratitude for his time and effort. I would also like to thank you all in attendance tonight for your time. Without further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Holladay.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It is indeed an honor to be here tonight. I realize how busy it is for doctors to do things on night, and tonight I want to spend time with you talking about the Pentacam, HD, and AXL, and specifically how to utilize the Holladay report for busy cataract and refractive surgeons. I know, having been in practice now for 43 years, that basically the importance, get my presentation going here, is that the purpose of the Holladay report is to facilitate the presentation of information for the busy cataract and refractive surgeon. I know that most of you have less than a minute or two to take in everything that you need to know for the cataract and refractive surgeon. And the fact is that we've spent almost 12 years now refining this report to have all the information that you need, and that's what we're going to go through tonight. Now, you need to be sure that you have a version that's more recent than 1.21 revision 33, and you'll have everything that was done on January the 25th, 2018. It has basically refined to have everything that you need on there. Now, the latest version, which is beneficial to have anyway, because it works out bugs and everything else that are in software, is only about 2 months old, so it's almost 2 years more recent than this version. But if you don't have 1.21 revision 33 plus, a later version, then you need to get it, and you can contact Oculus USA to do that. Now, the first thing we need to recognize is the display settings are fixed. And you say, whoa, well, I like to go down and I want to make a more sensitive scale, and I want to do this and that. And I just want to point out to you that these two exams that you see here are the same exam. This is one that was sent to me on the left by a user, and he had gone through and played with the settings and everything comes up green. And on the right are the settings that we've specified that are the best to be used. They have the right increments and scale for elevation, for pachymetry, and for power maps. And it's on the right, but these are exactly the same. And so you see that on the right, we'll see that reds and orange are bad. They're abnormal. And it shows up on this map on the right, and on the left, the exact same map with the settings adjusted. So when you load the exam and it comes up, it's exactly the same way that I have when I look at it, and the same way that I would set up if I were looking at that patient. So, so don't worry that you can't change the scales and stuff, because you're not supposed to. Now, there's 5 overlays that you need to recognize, and they're shown here on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, the first is the pupil margin. Notice I didn't say pupil circle, because it actually fits the margin of the pupil, even if it's irregular, as you see here, and this black and white dashed perimeter is the pupil margin. Now, the second point is this black cross with the yellow cross behind it, and it's actually black and white, it actually is the center of the pupil. It's actually called a centroid because it takes into account any irregularity. So it's the centroid of the pupil. The black brackets, which are these right here, are the center of the limbus and the iris, which is the geometric center of the eye. So this one is actually the center of the cornea, which would be the limbus, and the center of the iris. Number 4 is vertex normal. Now, vertex normal is extremely important. Vertex normal is within a few microns of the visual axis of the human eye, and we don't have time to go into why that is, but this visual axis right here is what's called vertex normal, and what you're doing is you're looking down the pipe of the microscope or the instrument, and you're getting a perpendicular to the cornea, which means you're right on top of that reflex. And it's the center of the map. As you see all the way around here, vertex normal is also the center of the map, but because it's the visual axis, any decentration or any tilt relative to that axis is what counts. Now 5, this little black circle that you have here, is the minimum pachymetry. Now normally it's up here closer to the center of the pupil and right around here, but I'm showing you this, that it's basically the thinnest point in the cornea. So these 5 overlays are what you need to be aware of and know what they mean, so you know what they are. So black dot on a white, vertex normal, the pachymetry min, the center of the limbus, the center of the pupil, and the pupil margin, okay? Now, this is page 1 of the Holladay report. And when you look at this, it has 3 panels at the top. It has 6 maps that we'll talk about in a minute. And the first in this upper left is your demographics, the name of the patient, their ID, the date of birth, the exam date, which eye it is, and what time the exam was taken. So all the demographics are up here. Now, the center panel is this one. All right. Now, in this upper middle panel, the information that you have is first the EKR 65 flat, K1 and K2. Now, we'll talk about what the EKR 65 is in just a minute, but basically they're K readings, and they're total K readings. They include the back surface of the cornea as well as the front. So they would be equivalent to, say, total K on the IOL Master 700. And we've had that there for 10 years, reflecting the back surface power of the cornea. EKR 65 mean is the average of these two. The axes are shown for the flat, the steep. The astigmatism is shown. The Q value, which is the shape of the cornea over a 6 millimeter zone. The total spherical aberration that we have in the cornea over a 6 millimeter zone. The ratio of the back to the front, which is about 82%. And then we have a parameter called RMS HOA wavefront error over a 6 millimeter zone. Now let's just talk about each of these for just a moment. The EKR 65 is what you use for IOL calculations. It's the total corneal power, adding the back surface power and toricity to the front K to come up with an EKR 65. Now I'll tell you what the 65 means in a minute, but the bottom line is that these two Ks reflect the front and the back surface power, which today the common way to say that is total power. It's not net, we'll talk about that in a minute, but total power because it includes the back surface of the cornea. And this astigmatism here includes the back surface of the cornea. Now we're going to find out that it does one more thing, and we'll talk about that in a minute, keratoconus and a few other things. But it does one more thing in the logic, and that is if the corneal, say, has multiple powers, it figures out what's the most likely power that's used for distance vision, and we'll talk about that. Now the Q value is an interesting number. It's normally about -23. But today we look at the spherical aberration, which is a better number because it tells us the spherical aberration that needs to be corrected in the cornea by an aspheric intraocular lens. And it turns out it's not just the 4 or 0 term. The total spherical aberration that's corrected by an intraocular lens is the sum of the 4, 6, and 8 0 term. So we call it total spherical aberration, and it's the amount that need to be corrected by the IOL. So in this patient, they've got 0.244 microns of spherical aberration, and the lenses that are aspheric and available today, the B&L has 0. The Alcon has an average of 18, but goes from about 16 to 20. And then the Tecnis is -27, the mean of the human population. So these are the 3 values, and you can customize those to the patient. The back to front ratio is 82%. Nothing there that we need to worry about. But the RMS HOA wavefront error. Now this is root mean square, which you don't have to worry about. Higher order aberrations, wavefront error over the 6 millimeter zone. Now that's a very important value for this reason. First of all, in this patient, it's 0.300 microns. Now what it says down here in the bottom is that the RMS error, the normal in the population is 0.37. So this guy's cornea is a little better than normal in terms of optical quality. That's what this measures, optical quality of the entire cornea. Now, people have talked about coma and trefoil. The bottom line is all of those individual parameters are not as important as the total HOA. And several studies in topography and in wavefront have shown that these values are the best to indicate optical quality, much better than a single term. Now, 370 is normal. At 0.66, when this value is 0.66, the patients 50% complain of halos and glare and 50% don't. So here's where we have concern. When it's greater than 1 micron, when this value goes up to 1, it's actually 99.9% of the patients complain of halos and glare. So the reason this term is so important is it tells you whether or not a patient objectively is a good candidate for a diffractive, multifocal, trifocal, bifocal lens. Because if they're over 660, they're a little bit suspicious. They will have some decreased optical quality. But if they're over 1 micron, that patient is a bad candidate because they have halos and glare before you ever put a diffractive multifocal in the eye. That reduces the contrast sensitivity, and they're even worse. So these values give you a guideline of what it needs to be. Now, the nice thing, we've set up the software that when these values are tripped, when it's over 1, it turns red. So when you look at the map, if you see red values, you know they're dangerous. And if you see it over 0.66, it'll be yellow, and it means that you have some concern and caution. All right, so that's how you use these. The spherical aberration, you match with the aspheric IOL. It should be equal and opposite is perfect. And these values for higher order aberration are what you see in this little box down here. Now, the other box is the upper right-hand panel, that one on the top right. Now, because the pictures taken with the Pentacam are in photopic, the pupils are usually about 3 to 4 millimeters. The horizontal white to white that we use in IOL calculations is shown right here, 12.1. And it shows you where the center. So this would be the center of the limbus, 12.1, and that's where it's located. The pachymetry min is this value right here, the 550. And it also shows you where the center of that is. And as I mentioned to you before, how inferior this pachymetry min is shown at a location right here. And if that value turns out to be more than 0.61 millimeters, then that patient is almost assured to have keratoconus because it shouldn't be that far down. All right, so this box will turn red when it's over 0.61. Now, the estimated pre-refractive K, well, since I know the normal ratio of the cornea for the back to front, if I know the back radius, which the Pentacam gives me, I can divide that by 0.18 and it tells me what the front surface power should be if the person had a normal ratio. And post-refractive surgery, the ratio goes abnormal, but I can still calculate what normal would have been. So this number represents the estimated pre-refractive power of the cornea before the refractive surgery. And then it says what the refractive change is from that estimated pre-refractive value to the current measured value that you have here. So it should be 0. This patient's got a 0.2 difference, which is negligible. But this value is important because that pre-refractive K is what you have to use in an IOL calculation that uses what's called the double K method. Now, what we mean by that is this. When we run an IOL calculation, the first thing that we do is calculate what the effective lens position would be. Well, if somebody had refractive surgery and their Ks were 44 before the surgery, and they were -6 and they came out perfect, their Ks would be 38. Well, that 38 is the wrong value to use to size the eye and calculate where the ELP would be. Well, this value, the 44.5, is what you would use in the double K calculators that have that, where you put in the pre-refractive K and the post-refractive K, because it allows you to size the eye for the ELP and then do the divergence calculation using the measured keratometric power, or the EKR65. Now, you also need the anterior chamber depth for IOL calculations today. And the chord mu is a second parameter that tells you about the quality of the image with the diffractive IOL. And chord mu is the distance from the center of the pupil to the vertex normal, that white dot to the black dot, basically, from the center of the pupil to the vertex normal. Now, on the Pentacam, if that value is greater than 0.42 millimeters, patients will have glare and halos, okay? Because the separation between the pupil center and the visual axis is so great that you basically, if you put it in the center of the pupil, you're not close to the center of the optic of the lens, and vice versa. And the problem is you get decreasing optical quality or optical performance when it's over this value, 0.42. So this turns yellow when that's greater than 0.42, just like the 0.61. That is when the pachymetry min is too inferior relative to the visual axis. Okay, so these are the two things that you should be aware of in terms of values. And these are the things that are reported in that upper right panel. All right, now, the 6 maps, the first column is topography, the second column is corneal thickness, and the third column is elevation. And we've made this so that you can look at it and glance at it, basically, and determine whether it's abnormal or not. Blue and green are normal. Blue is actually supernormal. It's actually better than average or normal. Yellow is suspicious and red is abnormal. So when you look at the maps, there's no question about how you look at things. It basically goes from blue to red. Now let's look at these, the topography maps. All right, there's an axial power map and a tangential map. Now, I use the analogy of the Earth as an example of what an axial and a tangential map are. And that is that an axial power map is relative to the center of the Earth. So all radii are measured from the center of the Earth. So the Earth's about 8,000 miles in diameter, It's about 4,000 miles in radius. And so what happens is, as we walk around the Earth, if we had, say, Mount Everest that's 5.5 miles high, if it was a hemisphere, we'd go from 4,000 miles to 4,005 miles. So it wouldn't even show up as a blip. That's an axial power map. Everything's relative to the center of the Earth. A tangential map, on the other hand, that the tangential map is basically a local radius of curvature. So when you go from just beside Mount Everest, it's 4,000. But when you go up on the top of Mount Everest, that 5.5 millimeter hemisphere, mile hemisphere, is 5.5 miles. So it goes from 4,000 to 5. So it dramatically shows up. So the tangential map is more sensitive to geometric zane. Now, we just had a little question that said, does aggressive treatment of ocular surface disease improve RMS HOA? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, John Havanessian and I and Eric Donnenfeld just finished a study where we showed a direct correlation between post-treatment of dry eye and an improvement in the 6 millimeter wavefront error. So yes, it's an absolutely direct measure of the quality of the cornea. And yes, it does happen from permanent corneal scars and keratoconus, but it also shows up in dry eye and anterior surface disease. Okay, so these are our topography maps. Axial map, the normal one you're used to seeing, reference to the center of the Earth, and this one, which is a local radius that's far more sensitive. The other thing I ask you to look at when you see these maps are the semi-meridians. And you see when they're all broken up, that means that person has, on the axial power map, more importantly, because this one's too sensitive to pick it up on the tangential, but on the axial power map is another measure of regular astigmatism, okay? So this person was 300 microns, so they don't have a lot of irregularity, and you see that the lines are fairly, the semi-meridians line up pretty good. Now, the next one that we see is the pachymetry map. Now, the top one is an absolute map. We see here's the center, there's the center of the limbus, here's the center of the pupil, vertex normal is right in there too. And the absolute map is simply a measure of the, basically the thickness of the cornea as we move all the way up. And so it does definitely give us that map, but it's always going to be thinnest at the center and thickest in the periphery. So the relative pachymetry map shown on the bottom here is basically a map that shows us the relative thickness of the cornea at every point. So what that means is the cornea, as we said, is thinnest in the center and gets thicker as we move to the periphery. Well, what these numbers tell us is exactly what that thickness is relative to what it should be. So this point right here is 2.1% thinner than the average change in the cornea. This point right here, okay, I'm trying to find a positive one, right up here is plus 0.1 microns thicker than normal. So you see there's a little band of thinness that runs through this cornea that you can see on the relative map that you can't see on the absolute. So basically it takes away the normal change from thinnest to thickest and allows you to look at every point on the map. Now, One of the questions that's come through was chord mu greater than 0.42, but you center a multifocal extended depth of focus lens by having the patient look at the light during surgery. Well, that's not exactly true. The optimal place to put a diffractive IOL is halfway between the visual axis, which is the light reflex, and the center of the pupil. And the reason for that is that a diffractive multifocal lens wants to have those diffractive rings concentric with the aperture, the pupil. All right. It also wants to have the chief ray passing through the center of the lens. So it wants to have the center of the lens at the visual axis and at the center of the pupil, and you can't do both. So halfway between is the optimal point to put those. And what Amir Agarwal and the Czechoslovakian article have shown, that when you put the lenses halfway between, if that distance is more than 0.4 millimeters, 0.42, then it's too great to get the optimal solution, and patients begin to complain of halos and glare. All right, so back to pachymetry again. The relative pachymetry map we'll see is helpful because the thinnest point is shown here, but up here is where you find out whether things are thinner than normal all over the cornea. Now, the next map is the elevation map. Now, the elevation map is you fit a surface to the front, you fit a surface to the back, and you then measure the height of the actual surface to that reference surface. Now, what happens is this. The cornea is not a sphere. We know that. The cornea is an asphere. Cornea is prolate. It's steeper at the apex and gets flatter as you go to the periphery, but it's still not aspheric enough to get rid of all the spherical aberration. That's where we showed it's 0.244 microns. So we know that the cornea, although it's prolate, is not prolate enough. It needs to be about twice as prolate as it is to get rid of all of it, okay? But that normal surface of minus 0.23 Q and about 27 microns is still the best reference to use to see if the cornea is normal. So we use the normal minus 23, take an aspheric surface and look and see whether it's above or below that reference surface, all right? And the back surface, we'll find in a moment, is actually more sensitive because the epithelium, when the lid goes over that, if you've got a little steep area, it tends to flatten it. Well, that doesn't happen on the back surface. So we'll see the back is more sensitive. So the elevation on the front and the back are to a prolate normal reference surface that tells us whether the real surface is above or below. All right. Now this is page 2, okay, page 2. Now in the upper left is the EKR 65 versus the pupil size. All right, so here's a 1 millimeter pupil with the parameters. Here's the 4.5, which is the normal size to use, and here's a 7 millimeter. Now why do I say the 4.5 millimeter is the right column to use in most patients? Because in a cataract patient, average age 72, the mesopic pupil size in the lane when you're testing vision is 4.5 millimeters. Okay, that's the average. Now you're going to have people that have people that are on myotics, for example, or for whatever reason their pupil in the lane is 3 millimeters. Well, if it is, then these Ks are going to be better than the 4.5 millimeter. But if you have a normal patient that's not on medication and it comes into the room, their average pupil size will be 4.5, and studies that we've done show that this column is the best one to use for our EKR 65. Now, the next thing, and you see how many points, 39,968 points are taken to calculate these values, all right? Now, This little graph on the right is a graph of the mean EKR65. And in the normal cornea, as we said, even though the cornea is steepest in the center, and that would be this radius value that we have, and then it gets flatter as we go down, the actual power of the cornea using Snell's law actually increases, and that's why we have spherical aberration, because our power goes up. But the blue curve is the EKR65 mean. Now, in the lower left-hand corner is the frequency of the power, okay? This map over here on the right is the EKR65. And what this graph is a frequency plot of the power. And what it shows is, this is a patient with regular astigmatism. They have a lot at 43.5, and that's this axis. And they have a lot at about 46, and that's this axis. But in between, as we go from here to here, they have power, but it's just not as much as those two principal meridians. So this basically is a picture of what we see in regular astigmatism. And this red circle that you see over here, now this is the EKR65 map, is the 4.5 millimeter zone. So you see, this is the power distribution in that red circle that we have in here. So we see there's a little bit bigger area of the flatter power than the steeper power in that zone, with this gradual kind of a change from here to here. But this is the distribution of power. Now, what happens is, we'll see in a minute that EKR65 does more than just take into account the back surface of the cornea. Oh, by the way, that map that I just showed you is a map of the total power. This is the back plus the front surface added together. So this is the EKR65 in that actual zone. Okay. Now, IOL power calculations. As I said, the EKR65 gives you front and back surface power added together. Now, what happens is, we didn't have, even 10 years ago, we didn't want to have to change all of our A constants. So what happens is, the back surface power normally, as is 82%, the back curve to the front curve. Well, that ratio is normal. So, and that turns out to be a certain about -5.5, -5.6 diopters of power. If the back surface is the normal radius, then we report a K reading that's normal. In other words, if your K reading was 45 and your back surface is normal, we still report 45 diopters as the total K, or the EKR65, because that's normal. Your back surface power is normal. Now, if on the other hand, your back surface power is, say, 0.3 of a diopter more negative than normal, well then we'll take that back surface power that's abnormal, a value that's more negative than normal, and we'll subtract it from that 45 diopter and give you 44.7. So that's the same thing that's done on the IOL Master 700. For a normal cornea with the 82% ratio, the K reading doesn't change. The spheral equivalent power is exactly what it was. But if the back surface power is more or less, then that difference from normal will be added to the K reading, so you get the benefit of the spheral equivalent difference in the back surface power with the EKR65. So that's what it does to that calculation. Now, let's take a look at a couple of maps. All right. So our first map, we look, and I look at the maps first and then go up to these values. So I look here and I see some red. Okay, well, it just means it's steeper than normal. I also notice that the semi-meridians on the axial power map are not aligned. So this person has irregular astigmatism. Okay. I look at the tangential map and it confirms that there's some irregularity with the high power in the middle. I look at the pachymetry map and I notice that the thinnest point of the cornea is much more inferior than normal, and I look up and I see that that value is 0.78. Well, that's more than the 0.66 that I talked, or 61 that I talked about before, and that means that that thinnest point is much more inferior than it should be. So the big red flag goes up, a decentered, displaced inferiorly thinnest point with a hot spot on both of these. And then I look down and I notice, gee, that's orange at 7.1, which is caution, not necessarily danger, but it's at the same point. I look over here and I see that the elevation map is 11 microns on the front, but 19 microns on the back. Now, why would it only be 11 on the front and 19 on the back? Well, it's what I was talking to you about before. The upper lid rubs on the cornea, and that little steep spot right there, an epithelial cell is about 4 to 6 microns thick. So and there's about 4 to 6 epithelial cells in the center of the cornea in that thickness. So the average thickness of the cornea epithelium in here is about 50 microns. So this 11 microns represents 2.5 epithelial cells, okay? 19 represents about 4 epithelial cells. So all that's happened is that lid goes across there every day, and 1,000,000 times a year is the average number of blinks that we have. It rubs off a couple of epithelial cells, so the posterior surface is a much more sensitive measure of a bump on the front of the cornea, or on the cornea posteriorly, than the front, because the epithelium gets flattened out by the normal lid movement. So, steeper than normal Ks, displaced inferiorly thin point, suspicious relative pachymetry map, and an elevation on the posterior pole or posterior surface more than the front. Well, that basically is a keratoconus eye. You can call it foreign frust, but that's keratoconus. Now that's the right eye. Here's the left eye. And you see right here, whoop, on the left eye, I'm sorry, it didn't go through. Okay, we've already pointed out those semimeridians. Here is our page 2. Well, look at that. Page 2 shows the EKR 65, and what you see is there's a lot of power up here that's about 46 diopters, 45, 46, and then there's another paracentral area all the way around here that's about 40 to 41. Well, I'll ask you a question. If you have a diffractive bifocal lens that has 20 diopters of power and 4 diopters of add, does the patient look through the average 22 diopters of 20 and 4? No, they look through each optic independently. Now, a diffractive multifocal has 2 foci, and a keratoconic eye has a cap that's up here about 5 diopters compared to that paracentral power. So it's not a perfect bifocal with 2 foci, but it does have 2 foci with a lot of power in between. And the patient doesn't look through this one. In fact, you can take a keratoconus patient and have them take a near card and have them hold it where they see it clearest, and you'll find out what the power of that cap is. Most of them will hold it somewhere between 10 and 20 centimeters because they have a cap that's about 5 to 10 diopters more than the paracentral. And when they look off at distance, they're looking down here at this power. So even though 45 diopters is the power, what you see is the EKR 65 is 42.5 because it knows that the patient's not looking through this power, and keratometry will get this power every time. It always goes to the cap. It's like having a bump on a hubcap or something. That higher power always ends up where the reflex comes from because it's a steeper curvature. So it'll pick up this power and won't pick this. So that 42.5, and I've done hundreds of keratoconic patients for doctors, and we always come out with a much closer value than you get with using a K reading, because it always measures that steep power. So the EKR65 is beneficial not only because it takes into account that back surface power, but it also takes into account bifocality and irregularity. So for anyone that has irregular astigmatism, post-refractive, post-PKP, keratoconus, corneal scar, all of those end up with a better value with that EKR65, because it takes into account that multifocality and weighs it in a way that the patient does when they're looking through their cornea. Now, when we look at an eye, you'll see here's a normal patient with their distribution of EKR zone. Here's a LASIK patient with that distribution, about a 5 diopter range. And here's an RK patient, a 13 diopter range. So you can see why it's so much more difficult to get an exact calculation with post-refractive, and especially with RK, because it's so much more multifocal. But you still get a better value with that EKR65. Now, what I tell doctors is, when you're doing a post-refractive patient and you look at if their wavefront error is less than 0.37 microns and they look good and their optical quality is good, like you get on some of the newer lasers, they're just like a normal patient. But if that wavefront error is over 1 micron and you see broken semi-meridians on the map, well, prepare that patient that you may have to go back and do an adjustment. And that adjustment can be with a light adjustable lens. It can be with a laser where you do LASIK, or a lens exchange. But you want to prepare that patient ahead of time for the possibility of a second procedure, because if they're in this range, you're not going to hit that on the bullseye. The normal IOL calculations are 75% within a half a diopter on normal patients. And so that number drops down to even less on post-RK. So use the EKR65 on all calcs. And then what I was talking about, the average pupil size in mesopic conditions where we test vision is 4.5. But if that patient has a smaller than average pupil size, measure that pupil with a pupillometer in mesopic conditions. And if it's 3 millimeters, use that 3 millimeter zone. All right. Now, thinning disorders. Now, what I said was the average vertical displacement of the thinnest point of the cornea is 0.19. Over 0.61 is dangerous. That's basically almost always keratoconus. Now, you got to look at the maps, but you see a hot spot on all 3 of those maps that correspond to that thin zone. Now, let's take a look at a couple here, okay? All right. This looks pretty good to me. Good Myers, a little bit on the tangential map. The semi-meridians are good. I don't see a hot spot. It's a little steeper down here, but not bad. I do see a little orange down here on the tangential map, but that's possible. I look up here, and now I look at that thin, and it's 0.9. Well, that's more than 0.6, so big red flag goes up only because of that value. I look down here, and it's only 1.3% thinner than normal at that hot spot. So that's not anything. It's only 2 microns higher, and it's only 5 microns higher down here. So I look at this 10 micron, and yeah, it's a little thinner, but it's not thin over there. The displacement went over this way, and the hot spot's not there. So I would call this suspicious, okay? But this little thin point right there being more than 0.61 raises that suspicion to real. Now, this is the left eye. There's the right eye, okay? Same patient. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's almost always asymmetric, but in this patient, it's absolutely keratoconus. Hot spot, inferiorly displaced, 7.9%, and 32 that's a 52. 52 microns higher than it should be. Okay, that's a big cone. Okay, and you picked it up by the hot spots. But that previous example of the other eye is, because of this and because of that, is suspicious, and because of this. Suspicious. If both eyes were like that, I'd say, gee, if it was somebody 55 years old, I'd go ahead and treat them if they wanted a LASIK or PRK. If they were 20 years old, I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole, because they basically are, they haven't cross-linked their own cornea yet, so they're going to get big changes over time. So age has a big factor there. All right, now, next case of refractive surgery. We look at this case, and this has a critical sign. We call that a crab claw, okay? The crab claw is on both of these, and a crab claw is basically an example of pellucid marginal degeneration. Now, in pellucid, what we see is, look at the thinnest area is right in the middle. In fact, the area on the relative pachymetry map shows that this area right down here at 6 o'clock is where we get the thinning, because what happens is that 6 o'clock area gets very thin. It then begins to lift off a little bit. So we actually end up with steepening right down at that area. You see it way down here at the bottom, but then it turns flat again right above that inflection. And it's only down here that we have that minus 5.7. But look at this. That thing is 68 microns above where it should be for a prolate cornea. So this is the classic findings in a case of pellucid marginal degeneration. Now this is the right eye, and there's the left eye. It's even worse, 86 microns, okay? And we see the thinning down, or the steep down here. We see this thinning area down here inferiorly, a little more on the on this side temporally. But the fact is that that this, again, the crab claw is what gives us the answer. All right, now this case. All right, we look up here and we see a little steepening above, steepening on this map. We see there's a lot of irregularity in the semi-meridians. And we look up here and we see the thin spots really in the middle. It's only about pachymetry 0.39, so it's not inferior. It's much thinner in the center than normal, but there's no elevation. It's actually -5 on the center of the front map, and it's +1 and 2 on the posterior. So this is a typical LASIK patient. Very thin, and basically no change in the elevation on the front and the back surface. Now that's the left eye. Here's the right eye. See a little steepening here that doesn't mean much. A little steepening down here that bothers us. But we looked at the thinnest points still in the center on the relative pachymetry, and on this, we see -8 on the front, but boop, +14 on the back. 14, that is red, orange. That is abnormal. This is ectasia. This is a patient whose posterior pole or posterior cornea has protruded forward, and it's going to get worse. So this patient needs to be cross-linked right away because they're already ectatic. But the left eye is still okay. All right, so that basically brings us to the conclusion of the presentation. And I've tried to answer some of the questions along the way, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have. Get back to my screen here. So, questions?
Thank you, Dr. Holladay, and thank you everyone for attending. Just a reminder, on your GoToWebinar screen, there is a text box where you can enter any questions you may have. If you enter them now, I will be able to read them off to Dr. Holladay. If you missed part of the webinar, or if there's anything you would like to go back and review, you will receive a link to the recording within 48 hours. All right. Dr. Holladay, why did you decide not to display the actual numbers in the pachymetry map?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, we do display the actual numbers. Let me pull that up again here. Let's look at one. We do. That's what the top map shows. The top map shows, let me get this back up here again. All right. The top map does show the actual numbers on the pachymetry map. That's how they're displayed. In other words, this top middle map is the pachymetry numbers. In other words, in this map, you see 560 in the center, and it goes all the way up to 740 in the periphery. But this upper center map is the pachymetry on an absolute scale. That one tells you, in other words, what here is you can look at the colors and see what the thickness is. All right. And then the minimum is shown basically right here where it's 550, but that 560 is the yellow. And then we see that green is 580 and blue. So the color map shows us the absolute corneal thickness at all points. Now the relative pachymetry map, on the other hand, gives us what the thickness of the cornea is relative to what it should be at that point. So this point right here is 1.4% thinner, and this point right up here is 0.1%, and this is in percent. 0.1% thicker, okay? And this little band right here is a little thinner than normal that's running through the cornea right here. So to answer the question, the corneal thickness is shown on that upper center map in microns. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. If RMS HOA-WE is high or abnormal, and the patient wants spectacle independence, do you find extended depth of focus is more forgiving of corneal irregularity compared to trifocal or vice versa?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is yes. What happens is, and let's just talk about that just a minute. This RMS HOA wavefront error is a spectrum, and what I tried to show you is the 0.37 is normal. Let's look at those values here. And 0.66 is of concern, and one micron is above that value is abnormal. And so what happens is this. An aspheric monofocal lens has no forward scatter from the lens. It brings the light rays to a perfect focus. And so halos and glare are a result of two things. They're a result of the 18% forward scatter that when they talk about the light splitting, 41% goes to the distance, 41% goes to the near in an equal balanced lens, and the other 18% is forward light scatter, because those higher order aberrations above the third, fourth, and fifth ring hit together and scatter in a way that don't focus it anyway, so it's just forward scatter. Plus, we have a defocused image on top of the focused image. So if you're 3 diopters out of focus and 50% on the light on top of the other one, you see a halo and then you see glare. All right. Now, what happens is the most halo and glare is with a diffractive bifocal lens. A diffractive trifocal lens gives you the benefit of seeing an intermediate distance as well as distance and near, and the contrast sensitivity, forward glare, and halos are about the same. So the point there is a trifocal has a little more benefit, but exactly the same downside in terms of contrast sensitivity and halos. Now, the next is the EDOF. The EDOF is basically a +1 to 75 diffractive bifocal. You look at the patent, it says 175 diffractive bifocal. And so what's happened is it's pushed that ad close enough to the distance to where there's no longer a dip. And it only has 9 rings instead of 18 to 20. So the forward light scatter is diminished to about half, about 11% instead of 18. Contrast sensitivity is a little bit better, and the halo and glare are reduced. So yes, that is a little bit less than a trifocal or diffractive bifocal, but it's a little bit less. That's what we say. But it's not as good as the, say, monovision that you might try with an aspheric monofocal lens. So what you have to do is you have to evaluate the patient from a personality and standpoint to determine how discriminating and how hard they are to satisfy. And if a patient says, no, under no circumstances, I want halo and glare, well, then you weigh that against the quality of their cornea and the loss of contrast and glare that you get with a diffractive multifocal lens. So to answer your question, the monofocal aspheric is the best. The spherical monofocal is next. The trifocal, I mean the EDOF would be next in terms of downside, and then the trifocal and the diffractive bifocal would be next. And that spectrum has to be weighed against the quality of the cornea. So as they move towards that 1 micron, they're going to move closer to that monofocal lens, and the good quality cornea will move further down towards the trifocal lens, provided the patient is willing to tolerate the halo and glare. And as we know today, only about 7 or 8% of the surgeons out there, you guys, is the percentage of patients that actually end up with that diffractive or trifocal lens, because after the patient says, I don't like that halo and glare, your only choice is to exchange that lens. And that's why the penetration in the market is at that 7 to 10% level, because of the reservation that the doctor has. Other questions?
All right, thank you. Our next question is, we have a doctor who is using the Barrett formula for my IOL calculations, which supposedly accounts for posterior corneal power. Would using the EKR 65Ks be redundant with Barrett formula?
Well, not exactly. No. Now, let's clarify what that question is really asking. Well, let's talk about total K versus EKR 65 versus standard keratometry. Now, what Graham has done is he's partnered with Zeiss, and they did a study that showed in refractive surgery patients that the total K got better results than the standard K, all right? They've not shown that in normal patients, all right? Because in a normal patient, the number of people that have a back surface that's different with toric lens calculations or with power calculations doesn't seem to make that big a difference, because not that many have more than a 0.2 of a diopter difference in their back surface power from normal. But in refractive surgery, that number goes way up. So that's where it's been shown. Now, what we're saying here is that the EKR 65 is actually similar to the total K, except for the logic that looks at how the distribution of the power is in a zone. So it's much better on keratoconic patients and PKPs and other patients that have a multifocal cornea. Now in post-refractive, that irregularity is not always astigmatism and stuff. So post-refractive patients, I don't think there's a study that would show one was superior to the other. But the EKR 65 would certainly be as good, if not better. Now, the Barrett formula, we published a paper about 2 years ago in ophthalmology that showed that there was a difference between the Holladay 2, the 1, and the Barrett formula. But what that difference was is in long eyes. It was because in eyes over 25 millimeters, the IOL masters, 500 and 700, measured the eyes too long. So Doug Koch was the first to figure that out. And he went and he measured eyes and went through and did the Wang-Koch adjustment on eyes over 25 millimeters, because what happened is when Wolfgang Heiges did the original calibration on the IOL Master original unit, version 1, he had eyes that went up to 25 millimeters and down to 22. And he calibrated the IOL Master original unit to immersion A scan, not contact, but immersion A scan, so that they came up with exactly the same average axial length on the 2,000 or 3,000 eyes that he measured. Now, the optical biometry has the benefit of measuring to Brooks membrane, which includes the thickness of the retina, whereas ultrasound doesn't, but he calibrated that out, so they got the same answer. But what he didn't do is calibrate it for eyes that were over 25 millimeters. Doug Koch was the first one to do that, and what it boils down to is on eyes that are about 30 millimeters long, optical biometry, all of the optical biometers measure about 1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters longer than the true axial length. Well, when Graham and Olson and Kane, all of those people did their development of their formulas on the IOL Master and optical biometry, the Lenstar. So they automatically built the compensation into their formula for the long eye to compensate for that error that Wolfgang made. Well, we had recommended using the Wang-Koch for long eyes, and then about 2 years ago, we published an article that showed what's called a nonlinear regression, where we compensate because it's not exactly linear. As you get longer, the actual compensation changes, and so we came up with a nonlinear regression. And what I will tell you is all of the studies show that the Holladay 1 and the Holladay 2, which is a little better, does as good or better than the Barrett formula when you use that nonlinear regression for long eyes. And that was the only reason that there was a difference in the first place.
Thank you. With reference to the diffractive optic trifocal IOL, the optimal displacement of the IOL to reduce risk of dysphotopsia, is there more tolerance for this in an IOL with larger central optic ring on the IOL?
That's a good question. Theoretically, the answer to that would be yes. Only because for a 4.5 millimeter pupil with a larger optical center, the number of rings that would be in the pupil are less. So theoretically, that would be true. Now, from a clinical standpoint, I don't know whether that's true, because the optical zone differences are so small that I'm not sure they have a significant clinical effect. And what I will tell you is that if for the trifocal lens that has actually 3 foci, that those 3 foci that are there, the contrast sensitivity, halo, and glare studies are parallel to the diffractive. The only difference is that it has an intermediate value, so it has a benefit, but the halos and glare, contrast sensitivity, and those were all the same. So empirically, the only trifocal we have in the United States is the PanOptics, and the contrast, halos, and glare were no different than the diffractive bifocal lenses.
Thank you. If you don't have a pupilometer, would you use the Pentacam pupil size with any adjustment for pupil size regarding the HR zone use?
No, because the Pentacam basically, if you've ever had your eye measured, that light, when it turns on to do those 50 or 25 or how many ever sections you take, is extremely bright. That's why the pupil size is down around 3.3 to 3.45. So that's photopic pupil size. And when we measure a patient's vision, we do them in mesopic conditions. So it basically, you've got to get a pupilometer. And Neuroptics make one. They make several handheld pupilometers that you can get. Neuroptics, I know, is a very good one. And what it allows you to do is sit in a dark room where the patient's looking up at a chart and measure their pupil size. But the point is, if you, if you're about to do cataract surgery on somebody that has a irregular cornea, you've got to know that pupil size, because you need to know how much of the pupil is used when the patient's in mesopic conditions. And that's the only way to do it. So, but you can't do it with the Pentacam because the photopic pupil size doesn't necessarily relate proportionately to what the mesopic pupil size is. In other words, you can be 3.4 millimeters in photopic conditions and be 5 millimeters in mesopic, or 3.5 millimeters. It just depends upon the fidelity of the pupil and how much it responds to various light levels. So the answer to that question is no, and you need to get a pupilometer in order for you to come up with the right zone to measure all these things that we've talked about, power, and the, power primarily, but the other part of that is the IOL calculation. To get it close, you need to know the zone over which the power is distributed, because larger pupil sizes or smaller pupil sizes, you can't determine the power of the cornea without knowing the pupil size in mesopic conditions, and that's where the patient is going to be tested for a visual acuity. So that's what you've got to match.
Thank you. And with regards to keratoconus, do you plug in mean EKR65 for K1 and K2 into the lens star, or for the IOL master for the IOL calculation?
Well, I don't do either. I put it into the Holladay IOL consultant, which, by the way, that software is the latest for all calculations, and it imports the values from the Pentacam AXL directly into the Holladay IOL consultant, which you can see at Doc Holladay and go and look at those. Although there's a calculator for torics and back calculator that are open access that you can get to. You just go to docholliday.com and it has both those calculators there. But so that's where most of the people that I deal with, we've got over 1,000 users that use that software. And what happens is they don't put the values into the Pentacam or into the IOL master. They import all of the data into the IOL consultant software, and it does the calculations. It's got the toric planner, it's got all of these things, and it has the linear or the nonlinear regressions. But for example, the toric calculator that's in the IOL consultant is what Alcon is using to get their 1 diopter toric approved, because it's the most accurate. That paper that we published in the March issue of Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery last year on the total SIA is an article that everybody should look at. It's in the March issue of the Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery, and what it shows is that the surgically induced astigmatism that we've been using from change in postoperative, preoperative Ks isn't even close to what we should be using. What we should be using is the postoperative refraction when we use a non-toric lens. In other words, if you take a refraction with a non-toric lens postoperatively and take the preoperative K reading, you can find out what all of the factors that change that refractive astigmatism in the patient postoperatively. The refraction is the only thing that counts. And what you'll find is the tilt of the lens, the decentration of the lens, they provide against the rule astigmatism. We know that the posterior cornea provides against the rule, and it turns out the change in the front and the back surface, which is greater, are also against the rule. So a delta K shows you like 1/10 of a diopter of surgically induced astigmatism, whereas when you do it with spherical non-toric lenses, you find out it's almost 7/10 of a diopter against the rule. And the Holladay toric calculator utilizes that value, and it ends up calculating the toricity that you need to correct the ocular astigmatism postoperatively very accurately. So Alcon is introducing that this month on their online calculator and putting Holladay up there simply because it gives them better results, and it's going to let them get their 1 diopter toric approved.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about using toric IOLs with pellucid marginal degeneration and also with keratoconus patients.
Yeah, those are, well, here's what happens. That's a guess. You can't, there is no way. Let's go up to one of these guys here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. All right. So let's look at this guy. All right. Now, look at these Myers. Look at those semi-meridians on the axial map. Okay. The problem is there is no way, even though I come up and on that 4.5 millimeter zone, I say 81 at 171. It's 83 at 173. It's 80 by 170, 166. So there's a 5-degree fluctuation in that. And it's for the, basically for the different optical zones. So what I'm saying is when these guys come up, what I will tell you is simply this. If the semi-meridians line up, like we talked about on this guy here, okay, when they line up and they look like this, then I don't care if it's keratoconus, whatever it is, when these line up like this, it's going to come out with a good value. All right. When they don't look like that, when they're all over the place and the semi-meridians don't line up, well, see, this one is pretty good. All right. But this one, I can tell you right now, there is no way to come up with the axis on any of those. And not only that, that it's a progressive disease. So even if you hit it for a few months or a year even, that patient's astigmatism with keratoconus, unless you cross-link them and get them stable where those semi-meridians will line up. In pellucid, it's the same thing. Those are unstable diseases that are progressive, and so even if you hit it for a year, what will happen is it's going to change unless you cross-link them and stop the disease, and that's hard to do. So bottom line is, if those semi-meridians don't line up, then the thing that's been most successful, and I just got back from the Hawaiian Eye meeting, is to do cross-linking and then come in and do a topographic guided ablation to try to straighten it out and get it back to regular. And then after you've got a stable cornea that you've topographically treated and you have a cross-linked it to where it's not changing, then it makes sense to go in, and then you can use a toric lens if those semi-meridians line up. But to do that on somebody without cross-linking and doing a topographic ablation is destined for failure, is what it boils down to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holladay. This is all the time we have for tonight. Thank you for everyone in attendance and who sent in questions. Thank you, Dr. Holladay, for your excellent presentation and your added discussion at the end.
Well, Michelle, I want to thank you guys so much for helping us put this on, and I'm grateful to all the doctors who came and listened tonight, and I hope that we've been able to get across to them the importance and the utility of the Holladay report and gotten some things across to them that'll make it better for their patients and better for them. Thank you so much for having me.
This concludes the presentation. On behalf of Oculus, we wish you all a good night.